Now back inside the state capitol in Austin with George Kreil and former Representative Charlie Wilson on Charlie's War. This is just under an hour.
Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you here in the Senate chamber, this historic room, and it's old home to one of our panelists. What we're here today to discuss is the book called Charlie Wilson's War by George Kreil. This is the hitherto unknown story of how the United States was involved in the war in Afghanistan on the side of the Mujahideen that helped drive the Russians out and in its own way bring an end to the Cold War. It is a marvelous story. It is a virtually unknown story. It's a very dramatically told story in this book. The author, who is here to my right, is George Kreil. He is a producer for 60 Minutes, for 60 Minutes 2, and he took time off to write this book. To my left is Congressman Charles Wilson, now retired from the Congress, who prior to being a congressman was a state senator in this very chamber. And he really did some amazing things, some of which he is happy to have chronicled, and some of which perhaps not so happy. That will be one of the questions we'd love to hear today. But we're delighted to have them and to have all of you. I'm going to begin with let the panelists do the talking in just a minute, but as the gallery files in, I want to just again repeat that we would like to have all questions asked at the back microphone here, at the back of the Senate chamber, and if you will, when you're ready to, we'll probably be taking questions in about 30 minutes, and then you can line up at the, start lining up. And people in the gallery, we invite you please to come down and ask questions. With that, I would like to turn it over to George Kreil, the author, and he can tell us a little bit of how this project resulted in this terrific book. George?
I think that I'm a bit like most Americans, which is I would like to feel good and proud about what our country is doing abroad when it enters into an area of national security concerns. And I certainly was part of a generation which so many of us were influenced by when John Kennedy gave his inaugural address and created that sense of mission. And after that, I was also part of a generation which got struck by the Vietnam and came to be concerned for so many years about what we were doing. And I think I was probably yearning always for a moment where you could go back to that sense of mission where you felt you were on the right side and we were doing things in the world that made a difference, that could make you proud, and that were useful. And I can tell you that of all people in this world that I might have expected to find as the charger on a white horse doing good, the very last person I would have imagined in that role would be the Right Honorable Charles Wilson, who used to sit in this chamber and delighted most everybody in this city, and certainly in the press corps, and all of his colleagues in the House of Representatives with the astonishing things he would do and get away with. He was just famous for his capacity to drink more whiskey, chase more women, get into more scandals than any other legislator of his time. He was literally a genius at it. So when he set off in the fourth year of the Afghan war, in the middle of the Reagan presidency, for Pakistan, as the first American congressman or senator to go look at what was actually happening, you have to bear in mind that at that point, no outsider had ever been able to penetrate the CIA's inner circle, the clandestine services. No congressman, no senator had ever dared even to think that they could try to suggest what the CIA should be doing, how much money they should be spending, what kind of weapons they should be using. And so as Charlie, the most notorious and famous hellraiser and dangerous member of Congress, walked to the edge of the Afghan war, he had no business whatsoever to be thinking that he would, within just a few short years, manage to have transformed the culture of the CIA, to have launched what amounts to the largest CIA campaign in history, the most successful one of all time, the most ruthless, in a good cause. But these are some of the wonders of being a reporter, to encounter stories that otherwise might vanish and never be told. And ask yourself a question and try to have your mind imagine what the person looks like who is responsible for having funded and sponsored the only successful jihad in modern history. You can probably picture what he looks like. I assume you'd think he has a beard, and he probably prays 5 times a day, turns to Mecca. And you could imagine the way he thinks about the United States. At least most people would think that way. And so it becomes really astonishing to think that the sponsor of the greatest jihad in modern history, the force that ended up by giving the Soviets their Vietnam and Afghanistan, was none other than Charlie Wilson. And this is really at the heart of the story. And before everybody gets mad at him, you have to realize that back then, Muslims from Afghanistan were the freedom fighters who Ronald Reagan brought into the White House, and that we praised across the board as people who embodied liberty, who were really our surrogate soldiers in this war. But this is a story which we can't tell the whole thing right here, but enough to point out that it is once again the idea of how one man can make a huge difference. And in this case, Charlie, who began in Little Trinity, Texas, with less than 3,000 population, and growing up, listening on the radio to Winston Churchill right before the Battle of Britain, telling the English people never to surrender, and listening to all of our great leaders, and Edward R. Murrow and FDR at right at the Day of Infamy. Charlie was a boy who had one of those dreams that boys have, that he would grow up one day to lead a great battle for freedom. And this was a dream that was so big in his mind that he didn't describe it or discuss it with anybody because he knew he would be a laughingstock. And so he masqueraded much of his life as a pure hedonist, which is what he was. But late at night, you could find him in his bedroom after whatever evening carousing had taken place, about 4 or 5 in the morning, reading deeply into military history, every speech that Churchill ever wrote, every moment that would become perhaps a model for him in later years. And what he managed to do in the period of the 80s and the very end of the Cold War was to single-handedly use his influence on the Appropriations Committee to do something that no other member of Congress had ever dreamed of doing, which is simply to walk right into the middle of the CIA and tell them that they were wrong, that he was going to put an end to endless war and containment, that we're going back to the Kennedy idea of pay any price, bear any burden, and if you have people fighting for their liberty willing to do the fighting themselves, we will get behind them. And so what would have been a bleeding campaign that would have been good propaganda for the United States and fight to the last Afghan for the Afghans, turned into a battle that broke the back of Soviet power, that ended the mystique of the Soviets. And when the last Soviet walked out of Afghanistan in February of 1989, and the station chief wrote his cable, 2 words, "We won." Just a few months later, the Berlin Wall came down, and we began to see the end of this nuclear nightmare that we'd had for all of these years afterward. And this was really, this was all because of an amazing campaign that Charlie launched and led. And he hid in plain sight all the way, drinking, carousing, going to the war front with the Mujahideen, with beautiful former beauty queens, and hiding in plain sight always. And it is a story that could have vanished. And I'll just leave you with just one line, which is what the CIA director in 1993, at the end of the Soviet Empire, absolutely no one had been, no parades to celebrate the end of the Cold War, no person singled out for particular valor. But in a secret campaign, a secret ceremony, secretive one, at the Central Intelligence Agency, none other than Charlie Wilson was brought in. And the director began by saying, the defeat and breakup of the Soviet Empire is one of the great events of world history. There were many heroes in this battle, but to Charlie Wilson must go a special recognition. And then Jim Woolsey compared him to Lech Walesa, climbing over the fence at Gdansk to launch the Solidarity movement. And he described how, he reminded everyone how invincible the Soviets had seemed just so recently, and how Charlie Wilson had engineered one of the lethal body blows that had wrecked the communist empire. Without him, Woolsey concluded, history might have been hugely different and sadly different. So we'll talk about the aftermath later, but for the moment, that was my privilege to be able to come across and chronicle the story of this odd hero on the white horse.
Thank you, George. You and I have had a similar problem wrestled with. I too have tried to have the issue of how to explain to the public that Charlie Wilson was, in addition to being everything that was publicly known about him, was one of the most shrewd politicians ever to set foot in the House chamber. And I think your book, when you the highlight of this was how Charlie Wilson wound up on the House Ethics Committee. This is perhaps the story we will hear about later. Now the hero of our tale, Charlie Wilson.
Thank you. Paul, let me have this one because I do better on my feet. It brings back all sorts of sentimental memories to be in this particular hall. I used to sit back over in that corner for 6 of the happiest years of my life. I'm happy that my colleague and best friend Joe Christie and Tana are here today. I want to thank Paul Burka, who always gave me the benefit of the doubt. Molly Ivins, who sometimes has given me the benefit of the doubt. I would like to recognize Leslie Dawson and Candy Shy Hooper as 2 of our most celebrated angels. Their activities were chronicled well in the book. And most of all, George Cryle, who I never, ever thought that there was really a book here. And he and I talked about it late into the night, many nights, and I never thought there was enough for a book. I certainly never thought it would get written. And I never thought that in any stroke of the imagination that it would be a bestseller and would be a movie. But There were many different opinions of me when this was going on, and I want to give you a couple of them, and then I want to tell you a little bit about the war, and then I'm sure that Paul will sit me down for questions. Once when I had been into Afghanistan and we had engaged the Russians, the Soviet invincible army that terrorized the entire West and the world, turned out not to be as invincible as they thought it was, as when they finally became engaged with people who were not afraid to die and who were bent on driving them from their land. But anyway, this was after one particularly successful venture, and this is very complimentary and self-serving of me to read this, but I did many things in this chamber that were self-serving, so I will continue. When Brigadier Yusuf came to take the congressman back to General Akhtar and President Zia, he noticed something different about the American. His men told him of Wilson's valor and endurance, of how he impressed even the Mujahideen. Yusuf, who was not wild about Americans, couldn't help but be taken by this one. He was a brave man, full of energy, a man who dominated the scene, the general says. I had a lot of respect for him. He wanted to take revenge for American blood spilled in Vietnam. Now, that was General Yusuf's opinion. I would like to read you a book review written by some Australian pervert that I think you'll enjoy. Crowell describes people whose ethical decrepitude was complemented by unmitigated desire to be regarded as influential. There is hardly a person he mentions whom you would have in your house to polish your boots, but they have a weird fascination engendered by their total dedication to self-importance. The main character in this rattling good yarn, Charlie Wilson, was a U.S. congressman when the Cold War was raging. Rarely can the prefix "the Honorable" have been less appropriate. The man was a drunken, shiftless, ignorant, lying, drug-taking, zipper-flapping, corrupt, power-crazed cretin. His only value was his ability through membership of influential congressional committees to move large sums of money, legally and often otherwise, as subsidies and to purchase weapons and equipment for groups fighting the Soviet army in Afghanistan. The fact that most of the cash was wasted meant nothing to him. So, as my friend Larry King advised me when George was writing the book, and when it appeared that George was actually going to finish the book, that you can plan on getting knocked around a little bit. But as it turned out, the knocks were not that many. In 1979 at Christmas, the invincible, all-conquering Red Army invaded a small country full of illiterate tribesmen and shepherds, most of whom had never seen a toilet. We all thought at the time, well, this is just another example of Soviet tyranny. These people will be enslaved, as have all the other people. And of course, the great mantra of the Red Army was, where the Red Army goes, it never comes back. Funny thing happened. 6 weeks passed, and the shepherds and tribesmen with their World War I Enfield rifles were still in the mountains, sniping at the Soviets. This went on for another year. I began to notice, as did others, that on the streets of Kabul, Russian officers were being killed with knives and with stones, both in the darkness and in the daylight. After a few weeks of this, it began to occur to me that these 20 million people, that they had made the decision themselves to fight till the very end, that they had made the decision that their lives were not going to be sold too cheaply, although they were being sold too cheaply, and that they were going to make the Russians pay, and that the Russians were never going to subdue them. Now, if the Soviets and Russians had read history a little bit, they might have hesitated about invading this country. These people, without any weapons at all, had defeated the British Army twice at the height of the power of the British Empire. They had defeated Genghis Khan. They had defeated Alexander the Great. It's a very, very unhealthy country to invade. After a while, I finally went to Afghanistan in 1981 and met the Mujahideen. And I'll never forget the first day. Joe was with me in this big tent, and the only people that were in there were all men, and they were all under 17 or over 65, because all the rest were in the mountains hunting down Soviet soldiers to kill. I made a speech that day that I was extremely moved by their determination and their extreme desire for revenge. And I made a speech to them that I thought was pretty good. I told them that we were looking at the squalor of the refugee camps, and I told them that America would come to their assistance, that we would provide medicine, that we would provide doctors, that we would provide blankets, that we would provide warmer tents, that we would see that their suffering would end, those that were resisting the evil empire. It was a funny thing how they responded. The old men would stand up, and through their interpreters, they said, "You can keep your medicine, you can keep your antibiotics, you can keep your wheat, and you can keep your tents, and you can keep your blankets. All we want is something with which to kill Russians. And we want something with which to shoot down the Soviet helicopters." That made a profound impression on me. And I came home determined that we weren't going to let them sell their lives quite that cheaply. There was a great cultural clash between myself and some other members of Congress that thought the way I did, that thought that this was one outrage too many for the Kremlin, one too many. They were dropping bombs disguised to look like toys so children would pick them up and blow their hands off. And then their parents would have to spend all of their time and energy nursing the children, who would never, of course, recover. But that way the fathers couldn't go and fight the invaders. But we determined at that point that the CIA was wrong, because the agency's idea was this was a marvelous chance to embarrass the Soviet Union. It was a marvelous chance to bleed away assets that would be better spent by them in East Germany, threatening the West. And it would be a marvelous chance to show the world their tyranny, but they didn't have any idea of giving them a chance to win. And that was the great test of wills, and that's what the book is all about. This was one war that was a congressional war. It was funded and driven by the House of Representatives and to some degree the Senate. It changed the culture of the CIA. Before it was over, they had changed their mind, and they had decided if we were going to provide the means for people to fight, we had to provide the means for people to win. And the long and the short of it is that 9 years later, in 1989, on February the 15th, the all-powerful, all-conquering, invincible Red Army, ignominiously and in disgrace, marched out of Afghanistan and lost its standing in the Kremlin, lost its ability to influence events, and as a result was unable to persuade Gorbachev and other leaders that there was a military option in Poland, that there was a military option in Czechoslovakia, and above all, there was a military option to the destruction of the Berlin Wall. And all the rest is history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and in the meantime, you all can start going to the back microphone to ask your questions about this, and would appreciate it if you would. George, let's just do a little book talk. How did you go from being a TV producer you filmed over there? What was the little spark that led you to think that this is possibly a book? And how long did it take from that spark to when you really sat down to start doing it?
Well, it only took about 15 years to put the book together. But in the beginning, the odd part of it is that Charlie didn't strike me as a character for the center of a book. But I happened to find myself in Pakistan just at the moment when the very first withdrawal took place of the Soviets from the border areas. And Charlie was in town, and he invited me. I was with Harry Reasoner at that point, who was the correspondent for 60 Minutes. And he invited us to accompany him in to review the troops. And so we arrived at the border, and all of a sudden, that spark you're talking about lit up, because at the border there were the horsemen of Genghis Khan waiting for us, all these medieval figures with great beards and just laden with every kind of weapon you could imagine, galloping at the front of a caravan, leading us in with just unbelievable numbers of stingers and every weapon you could conceive of. And when we got to the fort, there were just hordes of these rather dangerous-looking characters, just delighted to see Charlie there, their commander, and they were all cheering and whooping it up. And we went. The day was like something out of, Alibaba and his endless thieves. But it was here were these great feasts rolled out, and men from another time and age, and a war that was being won. And for some reason, this tall Texan was being hailed by them as if he were their commander. And I didn't quite know what was happening, but I knew something was up. And Harry Reasoner at that point named the book. He said, "My God, this is Charlie Wilson's War." So that was the spark.
Right. We have a questioner in the audience, and let's take that question.
Thank you. I have a question for the Congressman. Congressman Wilson, is it true that you're hiding Osama bin Laden in the Trinity River bottoms in East Texas?
No, it's not true. And it'd be pretty hard, I think, to keep Osama hidden over there. And it'd be pretty hard to keep him safe at all.
And then finally, one final quick question about Texas political history. Would you explain to the C-SPAN audience and those of us in the chamber here why you were the author of the first Texas sales tax bill in 1961?
I'm glad you brought that up. That was when I was a freshman, as you'll recall, in the Texas legislature, and some of our leaders decided that the only way to defeat the sales tax was for those that were opposed to it to bring it up for a quick vote and get it defeated. I was drafted as the author, and as you know, the damn thing passed. However, in my, hopefully for salvation purposes, sitting in that back corner there, I would like everyone to know that I opened the filibuster which defeated the sales tax being put on food, and therefore we have probably the least regressive sales tax in the country. But I plead guilty to all of my misdeeds that occurred here and other places. I would like to say that George has been very graphic about all of my misbehavior, and all of you probably didn't have to read it to know it, but I would like to say that I am somewhat reformed now, and I would like that I would like for my wife to stand up and for everybody to see that I'm now properly.
How did you feel about the fact that when he started asking you questions about your past, when George started that, did you have a second thought about, well, maybe I shouldn't have agreed to be the subject of this book after all?
I certainly did. I certainly did. And it turned out that like you and like Molly and like all the rest that have chronicled my activity, George gave me the benefit of the doubt in a lot of cases, and it turned out okay.
Paul, I think you could even try to explain this one, but there is a law of political physics, which is that politicians tend to want to promote the positive about themselves and to de-emphasize the negative. And one of the things that Charlie did when he cooperated with me was always mystifying, which is that he constantly was talking about the unfortunate things, and with great graphic detail. And in the end, this was an exercise in code breaking for me. I had to constantly break behind the compulsion to present himself as the sinner that he is into the bedrock areas. And then he would come, finally encouraged, and give a good run. But it was never easy that way. Odd.
Well, and the other thing, the great mystery was that how East Texas could, which is supposed to be a moralistic part of the state, how they could tolerate this. Were they living vicariously, perhaps?
Oh, yes, you mean?
Yes.
I think that people tend to underrate the judgment of rural people in Texas, and perhaps rural Southerners in general. But for 32 years, 36 years, for 36 years, the people in East Texas elected me every 2 years, knowing all of the sins that took place. But I think that George has said that I was the designated sinner and that they got some vicarious pleasure out of it. But I think mostly politicians can survive a whole lot if they're not hypocritical about it.
Well, that reminds me briefly of a story. We'll take another question, but Charlie was a great source when I would cover Congress for Texas Monthly. And one time I asked him about one of his Democratic colleagues who the story had been at the center of this political battle. And Charlie, I asked Charlie about it, and he said, "Oh, he's always the hero of his own tales." I said, "Charlie, what about you?" And he said, "Well, I don't expect you to believe it." Let's take another question.
Yeah.
Yes, my question's for Congressman Wilson, and it's a comment and a question. I agree we won the war, the covert war there, but we seem to have squandered the aftermath. I wondered what your impressions are of why didn't we back the Northern Alliance? Why did we kind of drop back and hand the ball off to the Pakistani intelligence services, and then they in turn backed the Taliban? And it just doesn't make sense to me. We seem to have switched horses in the middle of a race.
Did you say, why did we back the Northern Alliance?
In the aftermath, why did we back out of there so fast? It seems like we cut and run before it got settled, and we allowed the Pakistanis to take over the running of Afghanistan.
Oh, there's no question about it. You're 100% right. If I understand the question right. But George and I were bragging about what happened up until February the 15th, 1989. And the truth is that after the Soviets had ignominiously, with their tails between their legs, snuck out of Afghanistan, the United States simply disengaged. And we had left a completely destroyed country, a country with 3 million refugees in Pakistan, a country that had no electricity, whose grazing fields were all had 10 million mines in them. And there was just really not much hope. Without a very strong effort made on behalf of America, on behalf of the people, that did this wonderful thing for the West. We might add that the Russian army fessed up to 28,000 fatalities. It was probably double that. These people who could not read or write, who were thought to be untrainable in modern weapons and all of those things, through sheer sacrifice, through sheer willingness to die and to be dismembered, they did it, and we were the beneficiaries of it, and we didn't even hang around to say thank you. And that's one of the great disgraces on America's parts, and that's all I can say.
George?
You know, it's a critical question because given the concerns that most people have, it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that this was a mistake because of what happened afterward. I don't think you can take away from the contribution it made to the end of the Cold War. It was a historic event. But afterward, most everything the United States government did was a disaster. It just, and it created unnecessarily the problems that we encounter today. Do you know the Afghans the Afghans themselves have never been engaged in what any of us would call terrorist activities outside of their countries. Anybody that comes in as an invader, you know, God save them. But outside, they don't do what the Arabs do and others have. But at the very end of the Afghan war, maybe as many as 30,000 volunteers, Arab volunteers, came in from around the world. They were not influential in the outcome of the war. They didn't determine that. That was all an Afghan event. But they certainly became ideologically engaged. They started to network together. Some of them had good causes, lots of them were really rabid, you know, including the bin Laden factions. And afterward, instead of us going in and even trying to bring that country back to where it was when the Russians invaded, very primitive, we cut and ran, and we left a devastated landscape in which the only people with any purchasing power were the Arabs, the bin Laden types. And they got running room there, which shouldn't have been theirs, and worse. They walked away with the capacity, because we never acknowledged what we had done as partners with the Afghans. They were able to believe or make people believe that it was them, with Allah alone, that was responsible for defeating a modern superpower. And it has fed a notion that's irrational and dangerous for everybody concerned, that it is the Islamic moment, and that having knocked off one superpower, you can do another. And we needed to have then, we need to now leave something positive behind, so it doesn't look as if we only could engage them to kill Russians and afterward, no responsibility.
Question?
Congressman, the Arab Afghans that George refers to after the war went out back to their home countries and went to Chechnya, Bosnia, Algeria, where 100,000 people died, and all over the Middle East they created turmoil. And
Who did?
The Arab Afghans, the Mujahideen, who were drawn into this largely because we helped to empower them and give them the sense that they could defeat this, this great empire. Did you have the sense when you were talking to these people that you admired so much, that you were empowering a kind of religious fanaticism that would come back and strike at the West? Was that ever a feature of your conversations with these people?
No, it wasn't. The idea was to defeat the Red Army. The idea was to destroy the evil empire. The idea was to not wake up in the morning wondering if the invincible Red Army had invaded West Germany. As a result of what they did and of what we did to help them, in my judgment, all of Eastern Europe was freed. 1 million Jews were free to leave Russia and go to Israel. All of those things, and it was only through our neglect that the blowback that you're talking about really occurred. But there's only, and much of it's true, because there was a vacuum there that bin Laden could go to and organize al-Qaeda and use against the West. I think that that could have occurred in several other places. I think it could have occurred in Burma. I think it could have occurred in Yemen. I think it could have occurred several other places. But the fact is that it did occur in Afghanistan, and it did occur because we walked away from a job that was not finished. I would like to point out one thing that George thinks I'm overly defensive when I do this, but people think of the Afghans because of the Taliban. They think of the Afghans as worldwide terrorists. In the bombings of our embassies in East Africa, in the two efforts made, the last being successful, of course, to destroy the World Trade Center, in the attack on the USS Cole, all of those, we have a list of 45 terrorists that we think participated in those activities. Some of them have been arrested, some of them were killed in 9/11, but some of them are still at large. But not a one of them was an Afghan, and not a one of them was a non-Arab. They weren't any Turks or Iranians. They were all Saudis, Egyptians, and so I don't think we should get them confused. But you're right in that an atmosphere was created and a vacuum was left that the radical Arabs filled.
And really, your concerns are valid in that if the United States is going to act as an empire and completely reconfigure the power realities of a region, having done that, if it does not intervene to create a positive energy and option, then you've just opened the doors for chaos and for unintended consequences. And so we really are just guilty as could be of irresponsibility after having performed something which was miraculous, a secret war that had 10 years, maybe $6 billion, not one congressman or senator ever standing up to oppose it, something that operated within our value systems. And then the moment that ended, for some pathetic reason, we just turned and did everything disastrously.
Charlie, was it a philosophical objection to nation building at the time, or was it just no one made a decision? Or was there an effort made to try? I think after 9/11, I asked you about this, and I thought your answer was it was just hard to find out which faction was to support.
Well, that was true, but if the United States had gone and stayed and been patient and spent $3 or $4 billion, we could have worn it down. I'm sure there were different factions in Japan and Germany in 1945, but it took a certain amount of patience. But most of all, we just left. And the first President Bush was president at the time, and I remember a speech he made after the Berlin Wall came down, and after Czechoslovakia had the Velvet Revolution, and after the Poles were free, and all, and he used the term. It's probably Peggy Noonan's term, but he used the term changes of biblical proportion, which I truly believe occurred. And it was a humongous distraction for the United States. And here, one or two of us were kind of pecking away, trying to get a couple of $1 billion more on top of the other $5 or $6 billion that we'd spent, and just nobody wanted to listen to us. Nobody wanted to pay any attention because of the spectacular things that were occurring worldwide of biblical proportions. And we pay a price for that. We were doing much better in Afghanistan this time, in my view, and we still are. There's still roads being built, there's electrical wire being strung, there is a life in the cities. But without pronouncing one way or the other about the Iraqi war, but it's been a terrible distraction from what we were doing in Afghanistan.
You know, the problem we had is that it was a secret war, and it really deserved to have broken that secrecy. The Cold War had ended. Soviets had collapsed. If we had acknowledged that this was a triumph that we shared with the Afghans, that it was a battle that we were proud of, it would have then hopefully have allowed us to have felt some accountability and responsibility to the Afghans. But as it stood, there was no constituency for it. So Charlie, who had managed to operate because of the consensus around an anti-Soviet presence, was suddenly without the capacity, without the leverage really to lobby very strongly for doing the right thing. And he tried a little bit, but as he said, he's pretty good at not pursuing lost causes, and he jumped out, and it's too bad.
Next question.
Hi, Charlie. I'm a former constituent of yours, but more importantly, my grandmother was a former constituent of yours. And just for the people who are here today that don't know you, I think that's a very important lesson, that you were always honest and forthcoming with the home folks. And the seniors were a large constituency of yours back home, and that you always took care of them. And I know you're going home on Monday back to Diboll, Texas, and I just wanted to know, what is your key message going to be for those constituents when you go home on Monday?
I'm just going to tell them I still love them.
We ready for another question?
I just wanted to know, if you were president today, what would you be doing as far as American foreign policy goes? What would you be doing differently, especially also as far as conduct of the intelligence agencies, given what you learned throughout this entire experience? And what do we as voters need to know as we look forward and make choices about the president for next year and the direction of our country? I'm a former congressional aide. I never paid any attention to international affairs before. I thought that was all a foolish waste of time. I've woken up now. I'm paying a lot of attention. I'm reading. But what do we need to know to be informed voters as we go back and look at 2004? Because this is going to be a watershed year. This election makes a difference. What do we need to know?
That's a pretty broad question.
You're a talented man. You can answer easily.
And in one sentence, I would, and I don't want to get into this because we're here to talk about the book and about the Afghan War from 1979 to 1989 and the defeat of the Red Army. But the short answer to your question would be, I would make sure that I didn't vote for anybody who was going to start any optional wars.
George, as a journalist, do you see any parallel lessons between then and now?
Well, the main thing I would urge everyone to do is to be wary of the impulse of Americans to find some group of people to demonize. It's the Japanese during World War II. We did a good job with the communists. And we just have to be very careful about remembering that we are the world. You know, everybody has a place here, and that in the case of Islam, and even militant Islam, that we have a history. This was a remarkable alliance that existed during this stretch of time, and there's just no reason for us to enter into a place where our minds grow small and closed and paranoid. We need to recapture what we're all about.
Another question?
Yes. First, I just wanted to say, Congressman, I always thought it was the domino tournaments that kept you in office. But, yeah, I have a quick question for George and then one for Charlie. As a writer, I kept wondering how much you had to tiptoe around identities with the CIA, because I could be wrong, but I assume there must have been some delicacies there. And then, Congressman, how much do we need to worry about the billions of weapons that are still out there and in the hands of the followers of Allah who hate the...
I'll let George have this first.
This was a quite unusual book as far as writing about the CIA, because I was able to talk to most everyone who was really critically involved, and it didn't just have one view. It included people within the CIA who had terrible arguments with each other, really thought that they were, some who thought Charlie was the greatest menace to the Republic, others who thought that he was the salvation. And there were, of course, some people whose identities I learned about, but who are active, there's no earthly reason to put their names in. But for people who have retired, their names are included, and I was able to get a great deal of cooperation. And it's probably largely because there were only 2 people who actually knew what had happened. Oddly, the CIA itself didn't know what had happened. It was Charlie and his co-conspirator, this marvelous, unusual fellow named Gustav Ricados. And the 2 of them gave me a pretty good inside look at how it had all unfolded. And armed with knowledge, you can then get to other people, and then pretty soon, with a campaign that stretched over 10 years, and their policy of segmenting information, balkanizing it, so a person who's a station chief in a 2-year period doesn't know what happens in the next 2-year period, and before long, you kind of possess the book on what had happened.
The problem of all of the weapons that are in Afghanistan, many of which we sent there, really has not turned out to be a problem, because the significant weapons that are used, for instance, against American soldiers today in Iraq and are used in terrorist attacks all over the world, the basic weapons are AK-47s, of which there are millions in the world, and which are made in China and Egypt and Syria, Israel, just made all over the Middle East as well as in the West, and they're readily available. SAM-7s, which apparently shot down the Chinook with the 16 fatalities, was shot down with the SAM-7. SAM-7s, they were readily available to the CIA in 1980 and 81, and we used them against the Soviet helicopters, but not too much use, because we were fighting gunships, which have a great many diversionary tools, such as flares and chaff on board. The only weapon that we all worried about, and we still worry about, was the Stinger. And it was the absolute silver bullet in the war. It was what really and truly defeated the Red Army, because of what it did for the morale of the Mujahideen to have something to shoot back at these savages that were mowing down women and children in their villages. And that heretofore they had been invulnerable. They could shoot, but nobody could shoot back. I might say that once the Stingers had been there for a couple of weeks, the swaggering Soviet Hind helicopter pilots, who heretofore had been the invulnerable supermen of the Soviet forces, suddenly became the Soviet infantry who had depended on them, began, instead of referring to them as their heroes, they began referring to them as cosmonauts, because they wouldn't come down where the bullets were flying or the Stingers were flying. But, and George and I had a little disagreement about this last night, but within Afghanistan, there were probably left a couple of hundred, maybe 300 Stingers. We did everything in the world to get them back. We got a lot of them back, but there's still probably 200 or 300. But there's never been one fired at an airliner. As far as we know, there's never been one fired. And the general conventional thinking is that they're unable to replace the batteries. So as far as RPG-7s, which shot down the helicopter a couple of days ago, and which shot down our helicopters in Mogadishu, the RPG-7s are available worldwide on any markets bazaar, as well as mortars and AK-47s and those things. The Stinger was the only sophisticated weapon, and thank God we haven't seen one of those. But they were the case of a great deal of worry.
There is one other problem, though, which is that Afghans are like Hatfields and McCoys. After the invader is defeated, they temporarily unite historically, and then when the enemy leaves, they all set at each other again. Only this time they set at each other with hundreds of millions of dollars worth weapons from both the Russians and the Americans. And that makes the effort of nation building and trying to work things out in Afghanistan wildly difficult.
We have come to the end of our program. I want to thank both of you, George Cryle, Charlie Wilson. Thank you for coming. Yes, I do.